Africa is one of the richest continents on Earth. Beneath its soil lies an extraordinary amount of wealth: gold, diamonds, oil, uranium, cobalt, platinum, copper, manganese, graphite, and other critical minerals that power the modern world. Today, Africa is estimated to hold roughly 30% of the world's known mineral reserves, along with significant shares of global oil and natural gas. The continent produces around 20% of the world's gold, dominates global platinum group metals, and holds well over half of global cobalt reserves. These minerals are essential for everything from smartphones and computers to electric vehicles, renewable energy technologies, and advanced manufacturing systems. By almost any geological measure, Africa is one of the most resource-rich regions on the planet. And yet, for many Africans, daily life tells a very different story. Across much of the continent, hundreds of millions of people still struggle with poverty, weak infrastructure, and limited economic opportunity, which raises a powerful and uncomfortable question. If Africa is so rich, why are so many Africans poor? The answer is not simple. It is a story shaped by centuries of history, global power, economics, and the way wealth flows around the world. Africa supplies many of the raw materials that power the modern world, but it rarely owns the industries built from them. The minerals leave the continent, the factories are somewhere else, and the highest profits are captured far away from the mines where the wealth began. And to understand it, we have to go back to a single meeting in Europe more than a century ago, a meeting that would redraw the map of an entire continent. In the winter of 1884, representatives from the most powerful European empires gathered in Berlin. The event is known today as the Berlin Conference. The purpose of the conference was simple: divide Africa. At the time, European powers were racing to claim territory across the continent. Countries such as the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Portugal, and Belgium wanted access to Africa's land, labor, and natural resources. But instead of negotiating with the African societies already living there, they negotiated among themselves. Maps were drawn, borders were decided, and millions of people were placed under foreign rule, often without any say in the matter. Within a few decades, nearly the entire continent had been colonized. But the goal of colonial rule was not to develop African economies. The goal was extraction. Colonial systems were built to move resources from Africa to Europe. Railways were constructed not to connect African cities, but to transport minerals and cash crops from inland regions to ports. Plantations and mining operations were established to feed European industries. Entire economies were reorganized around exporting raw materials. One of the most extreme examples happened in Central Africa. The territory known as the Congo Free State was controlled personally by the Belgian king, Leopold II. Rubber and ivory were extracted in massive quantities, but the system was brutally enforced. Millions of Congolese people were subjected to forced labor, violence, and exploitation. Historians estimate that several million people died under this regime through murder, starvation, disease, and demographic collapse. The wealth generated from these resources helped industrialize parts of Europe, but almost none of it stayed in Africa. By the early 20th century, a pattern had been established. Africa exported raw materials. The rest of the world built industries, and that pattern would shape the continent's economy for generations. But eventually, colonial rule began to collapse, and many believed that independence would change everything. After World War II, colonial empires began to weaken. Across Africa, independence movements grew stronger. From the late 1950s through the 1970s, dozens of African nations gained independence. Countries like Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Senegal, Tanzania, and many others became sovereign states. For many people, independence represented hope. The expectation was clear. Now that Africans controlled their own governments, they would also control their own wealth. But the reality proved far more complicated. Although colonial governments left, the economic structures they created largely remained the same. Most African economies were still built around exporting raw materials: oil from Nigeria and Angola, diamonds from Botswana, copper and cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, gold from South Africa, Ghana, and other producers, coffee and cocoa from East and West Africa. These resources were extremely valuable, but the industries that generated the most profit, manufacturing, refining, high-tech processing, and branding, were often located elsewhere. Instead of producing finished goods at scale, many African countries exported raw or minimally processed materials that were transformed abroad. Mining companies and multinational corporations played a major role in this system. Some of the most influential firms include companies such as Glencore, Shell, Total Energies, De Beers, and other global mining and energy giants. These corporations invest billions of dollars in mining, oil, and gas projects. They provide technology, specialized expertise, and access to global markets. But the profits from these industries often flow through international supply chains and financial centers, from London and Dubai to Beijing and New York, which means that even when natural resources are extracted from Africa, much of the economic value is captured elsewhere. Over time, economists noticed something strange. Countries rich in natural resources often struggle economically. They even developed a term for this phenomenon. Economists call it the resource curse. The idea is surprisingly counterintuitive. Countries with abundant natural resources sometimes experience slower economic growth, weaker institutions, and higher levels of conflict than countries with fewer resources. Why would wealth cause problems? There are several reasons. The first is economic dependence. When a country relies heavily on exporting a small number of commodities, like oil, copper, or minerals, its economy becomes extremely vulnerable to price fluctuations. If global oil prices fall, government revenue can collapse overnight. Budget cuts follow, investments are delayed, and social tensions can rise. The second issue is corruption and governance. Natural resources often generate enormous amounts of money, but if institutions are weak, that wealth can become concentrated among political elites, military leaders, or powerful business groups. Instead of funding public services, infrastructure, or education, the money may be diverted, hidden offshore, or mismanaged. The third issue is conflict. When valuable resources are concentrated in certain regions, different groups may compete violently to control them. One tragic example occurred in the Democratic Republic of the Congo during and after the Second Congo War. The conflict involved multiple African countries and armed groups fighting for influence over territory and resources. It became one of the deadliest conflicts since World War II. Minerals such as coltan, gold, and diamonds were deeply intertwined with the financing of armed groups and the dynamics of the war. But the resource curse doesn't tell the whole story, because today, Africa's resources are more important than ever, and they are quietly powering the modern global economy. To understand how Africa's resources power the modern world, it helps to follow the journey of a single mineral: cobalt. Deep in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the country that produces the majority of the world's cobalt, miners dig the metal from the earth. Some work in large industrial operations run by multinational mining companies. Others work in small artisanal mines, carving narrow tunnels by hand through layers of red soil and rock. Once extracted, the raw cobalt ore begins a long journey. Trucks carry the mineral hundreds of kilometers across the Congolese landscape to ports or rail hubs. From there, it is shipped across oceans, most often to refineries in China. At these refineries, the ore is transformed into battery-grade chemicals used in lithium-ion batteries. Those batteries are then manufactured into components and installed inside electric vehicles, laptops, smartphones, and energy storage systems around the world. By the time the finished products reach consumers in cities like Shanghai, Berlin, or Los Angeles, the value of the material originally mined from the ground may have multiplied many times over. But most of that value was created far away from the mine where the journey began. And cobalt is only one example. Across Africa, a wide range of critical minerals powers the technologies of the modern economy. The continent is a major producer of platinum group metals, manganese, chromium, copper, graphite, and other elements essential for advanced manufacturing and clean energy technologies. The device you are watching this video on likely contains materials that began their journey somewhere on the African continent. Inside smartphones, computers, and electric vehicles are elements like cobalt, manganese, copper, and graphite, all critical components in modern electronics and energy systems. As global demand for electric vehicles, renewable energy systems, and large-scale energy storage continues to grow, demand for these minerals is projected to rise sharply, which means Africa now sits at the center of one of the most important industrial transitions in modern history. But there is an important detail in how the global economy is organized, and this is where the real money is made. The supply chain typically looks something like this. A mineral is extracted from a mine in Africa. It is shipped to a refinery or processing plant in another country, often in Asia, Europe, or North America. There, it is processed into specialized materials and components used in factories around the world. Finally, it becomes part of a finished product, a battery, a smartphone, an electric vehicle, branded and sold in global markets. Each step in that chain adds value, and the most profitable steps often happen far from the mine where the mineral was first extracted. Which raises an important question. Is Africa destined to remain primarily a supplier of raw materials? Or can the continent capture more of the value created from its own resources? The answer may already be emerging in a few surprising places. Not every resource-rich country struggles. Some have managed to turn natural wealth into long-term prosperity. One often cited example is Botswana. Botswana is one of the world's leading producers of diamonds. But unlike many countries that rely heavily on resource exports, Botswana built a relatively stable political system and carefully managed its mineral revenues. The government partnered with the diamond company De Beers while maintaining significant national ownership and control over the industry. Revenue from diamonds was invested in education, healthcare, and infrastructure, and supported one of the fastest sustained growth episodes in the world after independence. As a result, Botswana experienced decades of economic growth and rising living standards, moving from one of the poorest countries at independence to upper middle income status. Other countries are attempting similar strategies, each in their own way. In Rwanda, the government has focused on governance, services, and technology, positioning Kigali as a regional hub for conferences, fintech, and digital services. In Kenya, cities like Nairobi have become important centers for digital startups, mobile money, and financial technology, with innovations like M-Pesa transforming how people move and save money. Across the continent, there is growing discussion about moving beyond raw resource exports. Some governments are investing in local refining, beneficiation, and manufacturing industries, from battery precursor plants to smelters and industrial parks. Others are negotiating new mining and oil agreements designed to increase local content, expand value addition, and keep more wealth inside their economies. Regional and continental initiatives, such as the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, aim to boost trade within Africa and support regional value chains, including in mining, energy, and manufacturing. And global demand for critical minerals is rising rapidly as the world shifts toward clean energy, which means Africa may be entering a new phase of economic opportunity. But the outcome is far from certain, because the global competition for resources is intensifying, and the rules being written now will shape who benefits. Africa is not poor because it lacks resources. In fact, The continent may be one of the most naturally endowed regions on Earth. But the significance of Africa's resources may be even greater than many people realize. Today, Africa holds around 90% of the world's platinum reserves, the majority of global cobalt, and vast deposits of graphite, manganese, and rare minerals essential for batteries, renewable energy systems, and advanced electronics. In other words, the technologies that will define the 21st century. Electric vehicles, energy storage, hydrogen fuel systems, and clean energy infrastructure depend heavily on materials found beneath African soil, which raises an extraordinary possibility. The global transition to green energy may depend on Africa even more than the industrial world once depended on Middle Eastern oil. For centuries, these resources have shaped the relationship between Africa and the rest of the world. Colonial empires extracted them. Global corporations built complex supply chains around them, and international markets continue to depend on them every day. But the future may not look exactly like the past. Across Africa, governments, entrepreneurs, communities, and policymakers are asking a new question. Not just how to extract resources, but how to build industries, infrastructure, and technology around them. If that shift happens at scale, if more processing, manufacturing, and innovation take place on the continent, Africa could transform from a supplier of raw materials into a major center of global production, green technologies, and high-value services. And that would change the story of the continent's wealth entirely. So the question is no longer whether Africa is rich. The real question is something much bigger. Who will control that wealth in the decades ahead? And who will benefit from it? Because the answer may shape the future of the global economy itself.